Welcome back to Behind the Curtain of Healthcare. You're in for a treat. John Erickson has forgotten more about physician employment contracts than most will ever know. His 27 years of experience shines through, and we want to bring him back for a live Q&A. Thanks again for listening, and if you'd like to be a guest, please let us know. All information in the description below. And welcome back to the second episode of Behind the Curtain of Healthcare. As always, we're joined by the wonderful Fred Newmark of Newmark Healthcare Services. And tonight's guest is John Erickson, founder of the Erickson Law Firm. John has had a 27-year distinguished career as a federal law clerk, U.S. Department of Justice litigator, in-house counsel, and private practice attorney. A passion for optimal solution fuels John's role as outside general counsel for physician groups and counsel to health systems and individual physicians. The combination of litigation-honed advocacy skills, incisive judgment, ownership mindset, business acumen, and a sense of humor allowed John to act as a trusted advisor, as well as a healthcare regulatory expert. His objective is to bring confidence to each client decision. His perspective from both sides of the aisle assists participants to approach transactions with a holistic, reasonable view and clear expectations. John graduated from the University of Michigan with honors from the Maurer School of Law at Indiana University, Bloomington. He is one of 7 children, a husband of 22 years, father of 3, plays men's league ice hockey twice a week, and enjoys a bourbon neat every now and then. Welcome to the show, John.
Thanks, Jack.
So that was quite a bit of legal work that you do in the medical field. What do you think the biggest reason a physician should use an attorney, for example, to review their employment contract?
Probably 3 reasons. The first is the importance of an employment contract. As physicians know, when they spend all that time and training and effort to get where they are, to finally get a job or get the optimal job they want if they're already working, it's a big step in life, and it has big consequences. The second thing is that you might think, or physicians might think, that all contracts are the same. They're not at all. There's a great variety in contracts, and that variety can either help a physician or sometimes hurt the physicians. And the third thing is, sometimes physicians have particular desires. They have objectives that aren't typical. For example, a physician might say, I really don't want to take a lot of call. Some physicians might not care, but some may be really interested in call, and that's a part of the contract that they want to make sure is covered. So for all of those reasons, it makes sense to have counsel, because as physicians also know, when you're doing something important in life where there's subtleties and complications and things aren't always obvious, and these contracts are not intuitive in many respects, a non-compete on a physician could be a life-altering event, and especially if it's a surprise to the physician. And whether a particular state or even a county is known for enforcing those or not is a very important thing to know up front.
So would you say that there's a specific phase in a physician's career where they should start interacting with an attorney? I remember when I was a candidate side recruiter 10 years ago, a lot of the residents would say that they had mentors or they had something in the program. Would you suggest it right out of the gate, or maybe after they have a few years of experience under their belt?
It depends on the physician and their comfort level. My view is, for example, as an attorney who represents a lot of individual physicians coming out of residency, coming out of fellowship, getting their first job, and I also represent a lot of experienced physicians. I believe the mentors and the people they can talk to in their programs are great to talk about the cultural fit, of where they're going. If somebody knows, for example, that a particular system is known for positively or negatively for this or that, that's the great information that only their peers really have a great handle on typically, or people in the industry in that respect. When it comes to legal help, though, and the contract terms, I would say that, that it never hurts, and it's really not that expensive. And I always talk about, one thing that people want to have or should want to have is confidence. And checking with an attorney, and it's not that expensive. Checking with an attorney to give someone that confidence, to me, is worth much more than it costs.
Yeah, and also I'll double down on what you said, John, because in the 16 years that I've been in healthcare recruiting, what I have found is mentors and people in training have a certain viewpoint. And to some extent, they're limited to the construct of their viewpoint, and they believe what they're sharing. They believe they're giving suggestion and advice in good faith. but it's their life experience. Some of them have never been outside the world of academia. Some of them have maybe only been under one or two contracts, and they don't have the expertise of someone like yourself who have seen. If I was to ask you to ballpark, how many physician contracts do you think you've worked on over the span of your career? Might be a hard number to quantify.
Multiple hundreds.
Okay.
Probably 400 or more. Just hundreds. And that's, to your point, Fred, all over the country. I have the luxury, I guess, you might call it, of working with a lot of physicians, East Coast, South Florida, West Coast, Midwest. It's great. And so that perspective, you're right on, because if someone only knows either a particular part of the country, for example, or a particular system, or, their own specialty, we know specialties differ greatly.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to know, but when you see all these different, there are several attorneys out there that that have that kind of experience. That kind of broad-based experience is, I feel like, for example, today, after I've done this many years, I couldn't tell you how much more valuable my advice is to clients because of the experience. I'm not any smarter, and it's not regulatory knowledge or books. It's having been, as you all know, with anything in life, right? Having been through and seen the crazy things. And a lot of what we do is psychology, knowing when to ask for what and how to ask for what, and knowing how to, counsel a physician to say, you may think you want that, you're not going to get it. And let me explain why you really don't want, these are things that only come with experience. That's why I say some things are not intuitive. A lot of things aren't intuitive. And so it's great to be able to sit down with absolute confidence and say to a physician, I don't know what the contract is, but I will be able to tell you, at the end of the day, give you the confidence that you're making the right call and you're optimizing your situation.
Well, what would you say the most common areas of concern there are, very broadly, just the real, besides, we've already brought up non-competes, and I think that's kind of its own subject. I remember that from my candidate days. But beyond that, what are some of the more maybe surprising ones?
So let's speak generally first. To me, it's four main areas, right? What am I going to be asked to do? As a physician should ask herself or himself this. Number one, what am I going to be asked to do? And we can talk about that in a second. Number two, what am I going to get paid for what I'm asked to do? Number three, what happens, or what can cause this relationship to end? And number four is what happens when the relationship ends. I would say everything falls into those four, buckets. And the important things on the front end, what am I being asked to do? I mentioned one before. Many physicians, especially when they've been a physician for several years and they've had to take call and they realize how distasteful it is, have a real aversion to being stuck with excess call. And that may mean different things to different people. But my first thing I look at in a contract is, what is the call obligation here? Is it spelled out or isn't it? And like everything with the contract, let's say a contract is silent on that. I want to ask the physician, because it's not just about me telling the physician what they should be wanting or thinking. I want to ask the physician, does this matter to you? I have some folks who say, I don't mind doing 1 and 2. I've done it my whole life. Doesn't bother me. Other people would say I would rather sit on the street with and do nothing as opposed to, be paid several $1 million to work every other night. People have different proclivities for that. So that's an important one when it comes to, and then of course where you might be placed. Another things you're being asked to do. I didn't expect to be having to go to all 4 facilities. I thought I was going to be here near my home. Well, that's something to find out up front, and that's maybe something to contract for up front. And then the payment, of course, compensation is the big part of any contract. So, as you guys know, the comes in so many flavors. It's fixed salary, or it's salary plus bonus, or it's completely productivity based, or it's maybe salary plus productivity plus quality, and then you have other types of contracts. So these things are not things I find that physicians think about every day. These are things that I think about every day, and when the trade think about every day, but the doctors don't. And so it's important to understand, and as you know, there are national benchmarks out there. There's different surveys. So we can tell a physician, you've been offered this. Did you know that the median physician of your specialty, can expect to make this in this area? And they say, oh, I didn't know that. Or, yeah, I'm doing pretty well. Or, oh, I'm being paid, under me. That doesn't feel so good. It may be the right circumstance for them, but I want them to know that. And so compensation is important. And what am I going to be paid? Is it the end of the year? What if I leave before? All these things are things that you only think about when you have a contract. The third area was, how can this end, which is something nobody wants to think about in life. But of course, termination is kind of a nasty thing. But can I walk away if I don't like this? If so, how much notice do I have to give? Can they let me go? I'm moving my family across country, for example. Can they turn around and say, thanks, but you're not the right candidate? Here's your 90 days worth of money. Good luck. Is that a circumstance I want to put myself in? Those are important questions. And then, of course, what happens if the relationship ends? And it may just expire or maybe termination. And the big things there are, as we said, is there a non-compete? Do I want to work as a physician? Do I want to work in the area? And what is the non-compete? And when does it apply? And will it be enforced? Another big thing, which physicians would almost never think about, is tail coverage, for their insurance coverage. Many contracts, probably to the surprise of the physician, say, even if you're terminated without cause by the employer, you have to pay your tail coverage. And as if anybody who's paid tail out there, if you're an OB, you're talking about six figures. If you're urology, any kind of a surgical specialty, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars here. And if that's an unexpected thing, now you might say, oh, I can get that covered by my next employer. Sure, but that probably would have been a bonus you would be paid, and it's after tax. So these are the long answer to your question, but these are some of the main things that come up in virtually every contract.
John, one thing you were mentioning about compensation, and I don't know that a lot of physicians catch it on the front end, but salary could be acceptable, but the targets for maintaining that salary or for bonusing could be out of alignment with the salary. So I'm assuming when you notice those things, to your point, based on certain benchmarks, if a system or a group is willing to pay, if we just use benchmark verbiage, median income, but they want a doctor to perform 75th percentile to maintain median income, although median income may seem acceptable, especially for somebody fresh out of training, the workload may not be consummate with what they're going to have to do to maintain median, right?
Exactly. And another take, exactly right, Fred. Another take on that is, let's say, for example, the bonus is commensurate with the target for the bonus, for the target production is commensurate with the compensation. But then as the physician exceeds, let's say the dollar per WRVU, I've seen, some ridiculously low non-incenting dollar amounts, which I just plain don't understand. And so a doctor needs to know that. Listen, to your point, right? They might say, and here's the thing, many doctors don't even know what a WRVU is because they don't, certainly new physicians wouldn't have, but many physicians in private practice, they think about dollars in the door. They don't think about WRVUs. And so it's a major concept for any kind of a system employment, a health system or hospital or a captive practice employment. And so they may have no concept of how many WRVUs they produce. But then if they say, but let's say when they get the concept down and they say, I'm going to kill that number, I'm going to make this. You say, great, you're going to make an extra, for blowing this out of the water, you're going to make an extra $20,000. And they're going to say, that doesn't feel so good. That's my life there. That's a lot of quality time that I'm spending. So to your point, Fred, the national data is really good and it's robust. And it's a good way to be able to say to somebody, this is what you should expect. And if you're not being offered this, we should know why. There may be a reason, but you really want to understand why. And these are the kinds of things that are absolutely not intuitive, at least to my mind. In fact, I've never worked on a contract with a physician as simple as, as you mentioned, somebody coming out of residency who's getting their first attending contract, usually not a lot of bargaining power and usually a pretty straightforward deal. However, I've never, even in those seemingly straightforward situations, not had a physician say, wow, at least to a couple points, didn't think about that. Yeah, that's important to me. I wasn't expecting that. And even if somebody, a lot of times today, employers will say, doctor, here you go. This contract is non-changeable. Get yourself a lawyer if you want, but we're not going to change anything. Well, what should the physician do? You still want to understand the contract. Secondly, it may be that there are terms in there that are so distasteful, just because they're non-changeable. It may be that the physician might say, I don't think so. And I honestly, I've never seen a contract that is entirely non-changeable. So those are just some thoughts from the street?
Yeah, most contracts I've seen, the terms and conditions may be kind of set, but to your point, I'm really not yet in my day, and maybe you've seen some, John, where if a candidate was really wanted and wanted to be there, there could be some consideration for modifying things that are certainly reasonable. So a doctor may get that on the front end, that this is an ironclad, but I have found frequently that even if that's the messaging, when push comes to shove and it's time to consummate a professional marriage, if you will, that sentiment could change and soften a little bit.
That's true. And sometimes there's some pretty good contracts I've seen out there that don't need to be changed. And then it's great to just explain to the doctor, here's what this means. And they say, yes, that's what I'm expecting. And then the special sauce is to say, they didn't offer you a bonus. And I can tell you that virtually everybody gets a signing bonus.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's talk about your relocation. And that's where, the attorney knowledge comes in, because you guys probably know that with the tax law changes recently, the relocation used to be an expense that was reimbursed. Now it's treated like any other bonus. So if the employee doctor is not expecting it,
John, when did that take effect? Because I recently, honestly, just heard that, and I thought I misheard that. Is that a recent change in law?
2 years ago, it was part of the tax law changes that came into play in 2018, Fred.
So relocation is now considered income that's taxed.
You're exactly right. So it's a bonus. So therefore, it doesn't make any sense for a physician, in my opinion, to have a relocation benefit that's paid essentially based on receipts, because you're going to get taxed on that, right? In a perfect world, you'd get a grossed up amount,
right?
And therefore, I always argue to the doctors, cut that out. Therefore, I always suggest to the doctors that they ask for a bonus that is inclusive and fixed, that includes relocation consideration, but is not tied to actual relocation money, because it doesn't really make any sense anymore.
Totally get it. And that's too bad that the tax law impacted that component. So thank you for highlighting that.
Sure.
Jack, was there something you were going to ask? Because I have about 100 questions I could take over if you'd like. I think we lost Jack. No, we just lost Jack's volume.
You knew that. We still
Well, it's all good. So some things that I know, and these are just some notes I took, John, and these are just from my days of helping negotiate agreements. Things that typically come up are things like when I see an agreement where the employer says that any income you make outside of your job is going to run through the practice. So it doesn't go straight to your pocket. It becomes part of your practice. And based on the structure of how you get paid, you may not see that income because it's running into your practice. And then there could be an overhead component that offsets that money, if you will. So whether it's speaking or sitting in litigation or being a professional in some capacity, consulting, what's your thought when you see and hear that baked in? And I'm guessing you've seen that in agreements before.
Absolutely, Fred. And there are two aspects to that. The first is most contracts will say, thou shalt not perform any outside activities. And most contracts call those permitted outside activities if they're permitted by the employer. So you raise a good point. So one of the things to consider for a physician joining, especially an experienced physician who is used to doing maybe speaking or maybe writing a book, or there's a whole variety of things that medico-administrative activities that come into play, being a medical director somewhere, being on a board, providing charity work. There are all kinds of reading, maybe echo panels somewhere for cardiologists, or working at the VA, or doing IMEs. There's a whole host of things that physicians might want to do and may do. And so the first question is, do you need to ask for those up front if you're joining an organization, or you need to find out how they're going to, and then you need to find out how they're going to be handled through the organization. Because as you say, if you're not going to get any money for them, and it's going to take your time, and it's not for the love of it, that's something to know up front. And my experience is that most, that's where the big difference between private practice and system employment come into play. My experience is that many private practice employment arrangements will allow the physician to keep, especially partner level physicians, to keep that money as long as, you're not taking from the group as a whole to do it. Whereas my experience is that many, many employers will want to essentially discourage that activity by keeping the money.
Mm-hmm.
That's your experience also?
Yes. What I've seen, at least with systems, is, again, if it's a relationship that's bound to happen and everybody's trying to make it work and pulling together, that the bottom line is as long as it doesn't interfere with the time you're committing to us that we're paying you for, and it doesn't take away from those hours or that energy or focus, usually I've seen the agreement to be amended so that the doctor, but with that stipulation, it can't be on the employer's time or within the construct of what your obligations are to the employer.
Sure. And another feature of that is, for certainly employers should require this to be the case, and doctors should understand this, that if a physician is providing professional medical services outside of the employment context, then that physician should obtain professional liability coverage for that. And the employer almost always requires a physician to provide evidence of that, because the employer doesn't want to get nailed with potential claim.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly the physician doesn't want to be, naked, so to speak, when they're out there providing that any kind of service like that. So either they need to get it, let's say they're on a locums basis somewhere, they're doing some moonlighting. They want to make sure that it's covered by that employer, or of course they need to get it themselves, and they need to factor that into the cost. So there's a lot of things to think about in that respect. And you're right, Fred. Some systems are very supportive of this, and it's a cultural thing within the system. So, some don't want any part of it, and some are very supportive of it. And then another aspect of this is the IP policy, that a system employer has, which doctors need to know about if you're in any way inventive or even a book writer, or the IP policy that a health system has. I've seen several that are very comprehensive, and especially for academic medical centers, they'll own essentially anything that comes out of your time there. Sometimes regardless of whether you use the resources or not. Somebody might say, listen, I did this on Saturday night in my basement. I built this device in my basement, and the point is, no, I've seen policies say, no, that's your line of work. So you're going to assume that you're bringing to that. You're bringing to that some of the knowledge and some of the experience that we're giving you here.
So I'm going to give you a tell on this next question, John. I'm going to see if you have any idea where I'm going with this. So if I use the word moral inturpitude with you, do you have any idea why I'm bringing up that phrase? And we'll just see if we're in alignment here. Do I need to paint by color here, or paint by numbers and go for it?
Well, I believe you're talking about a basis for termination for cause. Is that where you're going with this? Yes. Yeah. That's so I think what you're getting at is that, physicians need to be careful about the reasons they can be terminated for cause. And why is that? Is because usually terminations for cause can be immediate, and you get nothing. You get you're out on the street. And if the reasons aren't well stated and clearly stated and fair, that is a potential time bomb. Now, most employers will say, we've never done that. And we spent so much time recruiting, and we spent so much money developing. We wouldn't do that. And so then the doctor would, through the attorney would say, or through the recruiter would say, well, then why have this in here? Why you're not going to use it? Well, we've had, there was that one case, where so these are interesting battles. And I think that's what you're getting at.
I bring it up, John, because there's languages you've probably seen over time. So who's buzzing here, by the way? Is everybody else hearing that buzzing noise?
I'm hearing it through you guys, but now it's quiet.
Now it's quiet. All right.
I was going to blame Jack.
I'm blaming Jack. No, because you see these very general comments, and then even if it's, well, could you describe very specifically what's immoral inturpitude, moral inturpitude, and no one can really. They can cite, well, it could be this, it could be that. So it kind of leaves these gray buckets of insecurity for any physician when they see kind of this overarching language. And it starts to sometimes feel how much of it is kind of angled against them to make it a little easier for an institution to possibly part ways for cause.
Absolutely. And I've seen language that's even less comforting than moral. It's things like not in the best interest of the employer,
Right.
things like that, or places patients at risk. You could put a lot of, doesn't take much to say that a certain behavior places somebody at risk or is inconsistent with policy, or these are terms, however, that typically aren't, it's hard to get these changed unless the lawyer that you're dealing with is really rational and says, you know what, that's not right. But usually the answer back is, no, we had that one person who, threw that fit in the operating room, and we just need to be able to get you out of here immediately. That's why it's there, and don't worry about it. And it's a tough one for physicians to take and lawyers to counsel them, because at the end of the day, you have to say, if there's not going to be changed, you're subject to that risk. Don't commit moral turpitude.
Right. Well, I'm going to give you one. Then this is true. Recently, actually, a physician that I was helping, who's accepting a position, not with a client of mine, but when I'm all in with a physician, I'm all in, doesn't matter if they take my job or not, I'm there to help them. And I'd never seen this before, where the agreement actually said a reason for cause was patient complaints. And if they trigger that, not only is there the ability for the hospital to terminate your agreement, but it also said they could terminate your privileges. So I actually took the time to call the Board of Medicine to find out what that really meant. And when you start to look into the granular aspects of the exposure that doctor potentially has, if they terminate the doctor just from a conversation and it never goes like before a formal committee, so be it. It doesn't get reported in the doctor's National Practitioner Data Bank. However, if it goes to any kind of committee, peer review, anything in a formal construct, it then is a reportable event that will show up infinitum for the life of their career as a ding in the National Practitioner Data Bank. And there's no number of patient complaints. It's completely just a generic comment just saying patient complaints. And to me, I counseled him, and I thought, I'm not an attorney. I don't have your background. I was giving him, my perspective on just kind of some of the high points. I'm hoping he calls you, by the way. Hopefully that'll happen soon, John. But I was warning him about that. So I don't know how he's going to feel, or I don't know if they're going to budge, but I'd never seen that in agreement before.
Yeah, it's funny, Fred, because I actually had an employer tell me that, well, see, you want this sort of soft language, because then we'll just kick this a doctor out without having to making it reportable, as if they're doing you a favor.
Right.
Which is really backward.
Because a physician may say, logically and correctly, I want some recourse. If there's a complaint levied against me, I want a cure period and maybe go before a board of my peers, right, to remedy the situation. Well, from the information I gathered, once they go before that board of their peers or that committee, and there's not a remedy to his or her liking, that becomes reported in his or her data bank.
There is a caveat to that, which is the nature of the offense has to be within certain categories to be reportable. For example, if they brought, the patient said that the doctor did say hello to me, and I'm upset about that.
Correct.
Regardless of whether that goes through a process, it's not going to be reportable. It has to fall within a category of patient risk and harm and things like that. Luckily. Otherwise, right? It's sort of like these. I have a friend in the restaurant business, and he said, social media is a real risk to him. Even if you make somebody mad by sort of enforcing the rules, and they go out and complain on social media, he sort of tried by the jury of the social media without any recourse, and so it's a question of whether you want to be or not.
Yes, no, they kind of shared with me it came down to behavioral. Not did he not say hello to me, but it had to do with behavior and clinical clinical care.
Sure.
So there were some lanes, to your point, as to what would qualify into that category. So
I will say the good news about this, in my experience, I have never seen an employer, I'm sure it's happened, but in my experience, I've never seen an employer attempt to use a termination for cause for a reason that wasn't justified. It's because they're usually buying a problem. And that's why it's a good idea for physicians to have a significant period of payment when the employer wants to terminate without cause, because most employers don't want to terminate for cause because they're typically buying a problem, regardless of how justified it is. So they'll want to terminate without cause. And so physicians need to know that going in, that it's a good, it's a reason. Nobody expects to be terminated for cause or anywhere near it. But in any event, it's good to have a good runway, so to speak, of let's say, what does that mean? I would say, 90 days is the minimum. It is used to be typical, and I think it's something to argue for, that you need 180 days notice to be terminated without cause, because as you guys know, it usually takes 90 days to get onboarded somewhere, absolute minimum 90 days to get enrolled and credentialed in new contracts for a new employer, let alone finding a job. So the 180 days for something that you don't ask for, you don't want as the physician, is and they're in between. 120 is also pretty typical.
John, have you had success with 180? Getting 180 for really? Well,
I would say 120 is definitely more common. If that's
okay, and I'm doubling down. All my physicians are coming to see you then.
And I also have success with if somebody's a big catch and they're relocating, then I typically argue for and have successfully received a severance. In addition to that, if they're a really big fish, a really great doctor, and they're coming from they're leaving a thriving practice to move to a new area, and systems appreciate that. And I'm talking about 25-year surgeons who bring a lot of clout and national reputation. I've had a couple of those recently, and both of them have been able to obtain a pretty good severance provision because the employer understood what bringing them in and then letting them go within a relatively short period of time, what that would do. And by the way, we made it clear they weren't coming without it. So it's always nice to be able to have that leverage. That's why my first question for a doctor is, do you have other options? Because if the answer is yes, that's great, right? It's a great place to be. And if the answer is no, we can work with that. But like anything in life, it's nice to know that you can say no. And physicians don't often understand, in my experience, that the employers are sort of more worried about losing them than they are about not getting the job. I always tell the doctors, if they're going to make you an offer, if they're interested, they're going to make you an offer. And there's almost nothing we can do during this negotiation process, because I also find doctors will say, "Oh, I don't want to ask for any more money," because then they'll label me as a a malcontent. I'll say, no. It's we do it first of all, we always do it a professional, nice way, right, and for good reasons. And that's job number one, right? That's one thing I like about healthcare is it's a round world out there, and we're always building relationships, and so you always see somebody again. And so there's never scorched earth never works well, which is nice because it's good to play nice. Secondly, though, it doesn't mean you don't ask for more money or you don't ask for terms. And I found many doctors just don't want to do that. They're afraid, and it's just not. That's where we come in, right? We speak for them, and I spend a lot of time honestly convincing doctors this is okay. You can ask for a bonus of X rather than Y. They won't walk away. The worst they could say is no.
Correct. So Jack, I know you've got a question locked and loaded, but I wanted, before you go, Jack, I wanted to just say, in transparency and fairness, because I think a lot of the perspective, at least that I've interjected, has been thinking about, because we're talking about physician contracts, the fairness for the physician so that everything is answered and addressed. I've also lived for 10 years on the employer side, and some of the safeguards that are in there are justified. And you are so spot on, John, when you say most of the time, no system or hospital that I've ever seen is looking to chase a doctor in a court, right? I'm just saying if it's over separation, we're not talking about poor delivery of care or, bigger issues. We're just talking about separation. And I will almost say a high percentage of the time, they want to, go with the the not for cause, if you will, clause. And I've seen many times where that's the appropriate thing to do, because the physician, presented one way that they were. I mean, if I was to pick on just a specialty as an example, and I've seen this happen where an orthopedic surgeon was supposed to come in and perform a full suite of all the services that you would anticipate an orthopedic surgeon to do. And oddly enough, they had a strong aversion to actually doing surgeries. And they were sending, and these are small markets. So it's not as if, so they were sending these patients out of the market. It was upsetting the primary care physicians that, wanted to keep their patients close to home. And they really weren't there providing, for whatever their reasons were, providing the kind of care that was anticipated. And we always know that the type of care is really ultimately clinically up to the physician. No executive can dictate to a doctor what's right or wrong or what should be done. But there are times where you see absolute patterns that are recognizable, and you see a physician isn't really fulfilling what the expectations were of the position. And in that case, sometimes those clauses are needed and justified for an amicable parting of ways, if you will.
Absolutely. And, one of the things I do is represent large physician practices, and they're not in the business of having partners leave or associates, leave and asking people to, it's just not good for that's not what they want to do. They're in the business of helping people, to your point. And so for them to make that move, it requires a lot of good reasons. And I've been involved in a handful of them where I've helped these practices, have to go to somebody and say, we're going to give you another, you want to give people another chance. Sometimes things people do are doctors do are not worthy of another chance. Unfortunately, there are certain things that are sort of the never do's, and those have happened. And that's why you need to be able to have these terms that allow you to say, I can't let you around my staff anymore or my patients as a practice. And sadly, those are necessary. Not very frequently, but when they're needed, they're needed.
Yeah, agreed. Jack, it's all yours. I know you've got a question burning in that forehead of yours or in that beard of yours.
So is the buzzing still there? I apologize for that.
No buzzing.
Gone.
Excellent. So I actually, way back to non-competes, have you ever seen a case, because this just popped in my head because it sounds terrifying. Have you ever seen a case where they terminate a physician either with or without cause and they hold them to the non-compete still and actually enforce it?
Yes.
Wow.
Luckily, none of my clients, it's anecdotal. I certainly heard this. That's the other thing about when we talk about how much do you want to go to the mat on certain terms, you're raising a great point, Jack, is that, and actually it dovetails with just what we've just been talking about, which is it takes a lot. Employers are averse to confrontation. It doesn't give them, many doctors will take the doctor's side, without knowing all the facts, and sometimes the facts cannot all be known. They're confidential, and so I find that employers are very averse to confrontation. And so, to your question, Jack, for them to actually go after somebody and try to enforce a non-compete is a pretty big deal. Usually, what they'll want to do, of course, is sue the new employer and get paid for the trouble. A lot of contracts these days will have a buyout provision right in it, saying if you want to pay, pick a number, $200,000, then you may buy your way out of this non-compete, and that is a more typical way I find for employers to seek to enforce those is to go to the new employer and say, I'm going to sue you for interference here unless you assist this doctor to pay this. And so, and everybody in the community usually knows when a doctor is going to work in the community, people know, it's hard you can't really hide.
Yeah.
So that's, so nobody gets away with under the radar from filing a non-compete. It's usually, as you say, a lot of times the employers will say it's not worth it to me to enforce that, and sometimes they're not enforceable. It's when you're talking with the doctor and say, okay, here's the risk you take. It may not. These typically aren't enforced here, but are you willing to risk the unrest of being sued or having a threat? And you want to disclose this for sure to your new employer. Many employers, I know, large employers, if they see that there's a non-compete and hiring the person would violate the non-compete, they don't want any part of it.
Yeah. So this sounds like I might be wrong here, but it sounds like there's no single track course to end up as in your position. Sounds like it requires a lot of different skills and experiences. So what do you think are the most important criteria a physician should consider when they're looking for an attorney like you, if they're not going to use you, which we highly suggest?
someone who replicates my background. No, yeah.
It's someone who drinks a bourbon neat on occasion.
Yeah, sense of humor is key. I find most doctors like that. As we were saying earlier, the experience part. I have run into doctors who, when I'm on the health system side representing the system, and I'll find that a doctor has maybe this is sort of stereotypical, but let's say somebody's dad was a doctor and they used a local lawyer in town for real estate matters or something, and then the son or daughter is ready now to join a practice somewhere, and they say, oh, you should use Ted, my local real estate attorney in town. He's a good lawyer. He can help you on this contract. And these things are not, again, they're not intuitive. I wouldn't try to do patent work. I don't do real estate deals, and there's a reason for that. It's those require special skills and special knowledge, and many of the things we've been talking about today, and the nuances to them are acquired over years of seeing contracts, and so experience is in this area to me is an absolute must, because a lot of folks will dabble, and you'll see many lawyers say, "Oh, I do healthcare law." Okay, well, how often? I've done a couple deals here and there, and it's just not something you want to dabble in my opinion. So experience is the absolute key. Another thing that I think, to turn the question around, helps me in this area is, as you mentioned, working both sides of the aisle. As someone who represents health systems, when they hire doctors and when they do deals with doctors, and when I'm representing practices who are hiring physicians and considering physicians for partnership, et cetera. And then when I'm representing individual physicians who are joining those employers, and maybe groups of doctors who are joining together, which is a whole different, kettle of fish. When you have a group of doctors who maybe are leaving their practice and want to join together, that raises some interesting issues. But those are each, having worked with all those kinds of situations and seeing, as Fred said, sometimes there are really good reasons for things. And I always say my job is not to get a doctor fired up saying, you need to be paid at the 90th percentile. You're worth $1.5 million a year, doctor. Yeah, but I only make 300. Don't worry about it. We're going to go in there. That's not a service to anybody, right? That's a disservice to a doctor. So to me, by understanding what they should expect, and that's why I use the word typical a lot when I speak to doctors, I say, typically, this is what would happen here. I understand you want to ask for this. That's great. Let's do it. But just understand that the typical, and I'll fight tooth and nail, but understand that the typical, and here's why. Here's why the employer is going to stick to that, probably because this is what's important to them, and why it makes sense in the long term across hundreds of physicians. It's not just you, it's hundreds of physicians they have to worry about. So those two things, experience, and I think working both sides of the aisle is not essential, but it certainly helps. And like the third element I say would be temperament and judgment, to be able to say, because let's say a new physician comes in and it happens today. I worked with a brand new physician, and she's leaving residency to become an attendant, to becoming an attending at the place where she just finished, a second fellowship. Pretty straightforward contract. I'm not there to try to justify my existence by finding people that doesn't really exist, that's not going to help her. So having the judgment to say, I understand the situation she's in, I understand what she needs from me, and it's not to have a 3-page, here are all the typos and problems, with this offer letter. Here are the 3 things you might want to, in my opinion, that's what's really good to say. Here are the 3 things you might want to think about. You may be fine with all of them. I just want you to understand that this is what can happen. And that judgment, that's not the judgment of a 25-year-old. It takes some time to do this, to figure that out.
John, I recently, it's about 1.5 years ago, had a resident, and I let her know in advance. I was working for a system at the time, that I encouraged her to find an attorney with experience. And I let her know up front that our legal department was not going to shine fondly upon a contract that was redlined throughout and editorialized. That, to your point, John, pick the things that your attorney feels are the most critical, that are in your best interest. Well, she didn't use an experienced attorney, and I kid you not, 75% of the agreement was redlined. And I sent it to our attorneys because that's what I was supposed to do. And she ended up taking my advice in the end. I'm guessing she paid the attorney. I'm sure she did. But we boiled it down to that 3, 4, whatever, the truly critical things that were most important to her. But she did not heed my attempts to forewarn her that was not in good faith the way to have an attorney, have an agreement reviewed.
That's too bad, and you raise an interesting point, Fred, because to take our old friend, the non-compete. My first question I ask a doctor is, if you aren't going to work here any longer, if you weren't going to work here any longer, would you want to work within 10 miles of where you are? They say, no, I'd go back to Wisconsin or something. I'd go to Florida. Right. Okay. That may change, right? That may not be the way they feel for all time. But if they say, no, I'm coming here for this job. And by the way, I know I could work 12 miles away as equally as I could work 5 miles away. This is no big deal. Then that's an important fact, right? It's not about me saying, I don't like this non-compete. Let's see if we can't take them on. It's about the doctor saying, this is either important to me or not, and then talking it through. So to me, that's a key thing, is to not create battles that don't need to be fought, like redlining. These days, contracts are all pretty good. You find an employer that's, especially a system employer, and they are so in love with their contracts. There's not a whole lot you can do. And so knowing that going in, right, would you rather ask for 10 things that are in no particular order? Would you rather say, you know what, everything looks great, but there are these really 2 things that are material to the doctor? And let me tell you, I always try to personalize it. Say, let me tell you why. Let me tell you why the doctor is very concerned about call. He's expecting, as a sick child. There's reason, but you want to sort of explain why it's an important request from the doctor, not just because. I always want to make sure it's not what I say. Right, I'm just there to channel what the doctor wants, which is important to remember also, because it's easy for the other side to say, oh, it's just the lawyer. I could say no, and the doctor doesn't care or anything. I always want to get the doctor's buy-in to say, do you want it? Is this important to you? Because if it is, I want to tell them this is what you want. It's not about what I want. It's about what you want.
Jack, are we doing okay on time?
Yeah, we're fine.
Okay, so without getting too much in the weeds on this, John, but I just thought it was appropriate at least to mention, because for the most part, we've really focused on employment agreements. And there's another whole side. I mean, there are multiple agreements, as you know. There are PSAs, there are recruiting agreements, and I don't need to get into a definition of all these different agreements, but I did want to mention, and anything you'd care to add, also not as common anymore, but still available, are going into a private practice that's already, aligned with a hospital, but not, they're on their own, they're autonomous, they're not employed by the hospital, but the hospital will support the first year, sometimes first 18 months of all of the costs of this new doctor joining this existing practice. And that sort of agreement is completely different than an employment agreement, because in essence, that doctor is literally taking a loan from the hospital that, as long as they stay in that market, they will be forgiven for the length of whatever the commitment period is for that loan. And if they leave before that period of time, they will owe back an amortized amount based on what was not forgiven. So my only point in bringing it up, there's actually loan documentation, paperwork that's very clearly spelling out this is a loan. And the aspects of the agreement are different than just kind of a cookie cutter boilerplate employment agreement. So I didn't know if you just wanted to give any insight or comment on that.
I do. The thing I find, so those, as you say, they're called different things. I call them recruitment agreements, where a hospital is able to pick up a portion, and they come in different flavors too. Sometimes they're a fixed amount, and sometimes they're saying if that physician has a deficit, because that physician is going to a greenfield area, for example, that's both good for the health system and for the practice. And this can happen, as you know, in purely private practices also. A purely private practice that's not affiliated with the system, contractually can have a recruitment agreement where the system will say, we've identified a need. There's a shortage of X or Y specialist. If you hire one of those, we will help you because we're legally allowed to do so by providing. And let's say the amount, let's say it's $100,000 or maybe $75,000 a year would be sort of typical, I think, for a couple of years. The thing to know from the physician side is, let's say they go to the physician and say, we're going to pay you $350. Doctor says, that sounds great. I like that. Then they say, well, we're going to pay you $275 and you're going to get $75 from this health system. What the doctor doesn't know, unless you're a representative, is that $75 you have to pay back. It doesn't do the doctor any good, right? It's usually the doctor says, oh, I'm worth $350 is the going rate. And that's great. And so one of the things I find interesting about those recruitment agreements, it's great for the practice because they pay $75,000 less. It really does the doctor no good unless, which again, I don't think is typically true, that the employer wouldn't pay that amount anyway. So it really creates a level of risk for the employee, which is often justified because it's, the earn back period, let's say it's over 3 more years. I think 5 years is a typical period for these. And you're right, it's earned back if you leave the area, not if you leave the employer. But that's a risk the employee needs to understand. And I think if more employees understood, they'd say, it doesn't do me any good. Why am I taking this risk? This doesn't feel right. And so as someone who represents, I typically will have a term inserted in the employment agreement that says, wait a minute, if you let me go without cause practice and this kicks in and I have to pay this back, then you're going to pay it. I mean, there are ways to think about
Correct.
This, which a doctor would never think about or typically wouldn't think about without representation.
Yeah, because if that doctor is, to your point, let go without cause and can't find suitable work in the market, the loan is between that physician and the system, not the group.
Exactly.
So, to your point, well stated. Well stated.
And it's, a key phrase I always have is through no fault of your own. If I always say, doctor, here's what could happen to you through no fault of your own. There are things where, a doctor I think understands that, listen, if I stop working hard and I don't produce, I'm going to face risks, right? I'm going to face economic consequences. That's understood. But something like this, where the practice might just say, we don't really need you anymore, or for whatever reason, we're going to let you go. It's nothing to do with you or your performance, or you weren't a bad actor. And through no fault of your own, you're going to have to pay this back, which is money you really were due anyway. Doesn't feel good. And we obviously want to protect against those, everything where there could be an adverse consequence through no fault of the doctor.
So, John, what could you share with the audience, especially newer physicians that have not used an attorney yet? There are a couple of different pay structures that we're all aware of. What's your advice to a physician that might be talking to several attorneys? Maybe you want to describe the pay structures briefly, and any advice you'd have as a point of evaluation for them. Sure.
There are 2 primary, which one would be a flat fixed fee. Somebody might say, I will charge you X. And usually I find that the new doctors, I never know how they react to a $1 per hour fee for an attorney, because it's a lot more than beer money. And it sounds like a heck of a lot of money to pay for somebody for an hour until you realize we're not talking about 20 hours. Maybe we're talking about 1 hour or even less than an hour. For some of these contracts, an experienced attorney can get through it and identify things in 30 minutes, so I tell new, so to go back to fixed fee. So you say, listen, I'll do whatever you need, doctor, for X. And I don't know if you want me to talk about what X might be, but for a fixed fee.
Oh, please do whatever you'd like to share. Do you recall the name of this? It's
behind the curtain.
It's behind the curtain, John. So that's what we want to do, is we want to pull the curtain back.
Sure. So, and I won't claim to know. I don't offer flat fees, because I'll tell you why in a second. But so I don't know any great data other than anecdotal. But I would say between $500 and $800 would be a typical flat fee. It could be more depending on, but usually the lawyers that would do that would be it would have low overhead, as I do, and would be able to offer a rate like that. You wouldn't find that from a larger firm. It just wouldn't be economic for them. But let's say it's $500 to $800, and the reason I don't like, so the other model would be by the hour, which is the way I do all my work, is by the hour, X number of dollars per hour. And if it takes a little amount of time, that's great. If it takes more, it costs more and takes more of my time. And the reason I don't like fixed fee personally is I always say somebody wins and somebody loses. And I don't want that to be me or the doctor. That's just my viewpoint on it. I know that people like certainty. It's good to be able to say, listen, this is going to cost me $700, and I know that going in. But if you, at the end of the day, the lawyer really spent 30 minutes on it, that's much more than you should have spent. And I find that some situations are 30 minutes, and some are 4 or 5 hours. If you have a physician who's if we're talking about, I've done some 7-figure deals for physicians, and when you're talking about that kind of money and somebody moving across country or something, it's not because there's more money involved. It's because there are more important issues, and usually there are things that can be negotiated, and those doctors have a lot of risk points. And so it takes time to go back. The back and forth is what takes the time.
So how do you evaluate that? And you put it well, because you said, I don't think it's just physicians. We all like certainty. And I would say that I've not seen it frequently, but I've spoken to physicians that unfortunately were taken advantage of with hours that were billed that should not have been billed, and they ended up with exorbitant fees. So if I was if I was a physician and I said, well, look, here's my agreement. Can you give me some kind of an idea? Are we talking 2 hours or 30 hours? And I'm going to the two extremes sort of.
Sure.
A purpose. So how do you kind of answer that question for somebody that is looking to sense, because, residents don't get paid very, very well.
So honestly, I charge a highly discounted rate. I figure that's sort of a charitable work almost to help the fellows and residents. I think it's a privilege to be able to help them. And so my own take on this is I will charge them a highly discounted dollar per hour rate. And I will tell them typically, if they're going to go work for a system, this will take between 30 minutes and an hour and a half. This is not, 7 rounds of back and forth. And I typically will charge most of them an hour, which honestly is really not worth if you look at it from an economic perspective, it's not worth doing. I do it because I like to. And that maybe brings up another issue about when you say someone's been taken advantage of, that really hurts me to my core. One of the things to look for, I think, for a counsel is somebody who's busy. I always say it's the same thing with real estate agents. I don't want some real estate agent working for me who needs this deal to pay their own rent. I want somebody who is busy and doesn't need to charge too many hours to make ends meet. And it's hard to tell who that person is, but you can usually get a flavor by how busy they are.
John, you know what that reminds me of? I don't like going to restaurants where the parking lot is empty. Right? I mean, you'd like to see the parking relatively full. That
exactly.
It's a happening place that actually delivers. So
it's a good market, and that's why, honestly, Fred, 95% of my business comes from personal, right? Somebody this is true for all of us, right, in service businesses, but it's very gratifying when you help somebody and you make a connection with them and they really appreciate what you've done, and then they tell a friend, you need to use Fred, or you need to use John. And I find that's how I get virtually all my business. And it's both gratifying, very, very personally satisfying, but it's also because you treated people fairly. The sad thing is, I think a lot of doctors wouldn't know whether they've been treated fairly or not unless somebody looks over the shoulder. That's the interesting thing about. I'm sure there are many doctors out there who have been helped by that. Maybe that small town local lawyer who doesn't know healthcare, and maybe they felt like they got a bang up job, but they're never going to know any better. And I don't know how there's, I guess, podcasts like this, right? There's these types of broadcasts will, like you say, draw the curtain back and say there is another way out there. It's like somebody who goes to maybe a physician who doesn't do a great job with a knee replacement, right? They're practicing on you. And whether somebody does it 10 times a day, it's how are you going to know the difference unless you're educated? So I think it's great you were talking about how certain physicians, ask around, and certainly word of mouth is great because it's a firsthand, clients don't lie.
So there's a fun aside I keep thinking about every time you bring up the small town, like real estate lawyer looking at a healthcare contract. That's in every industry, and specifically the number of people that I know. It's like, oh, they're a CPA. They'll be able to handle federal compliance, and they have no idea what it's about. It's such a common kind of pitfall that's avoidable, that you really want to specialize with someone who does the one thing in the industry, or, very, very focused on a track, has that day-to-day experience, because all of this stuff in any industry can change. Trends change, systems follow other systems, and you really got to be plugged into what's going on to make sure that you have all the information to actually know what you're looking at.
Absolutely. And I want to make clear, this is no disrespect. I mean, I'm from a small
Absolutely.
town. I'm a solo lawyer, right? So I can't sit here on a high, you might argue if I worked for a 400 person law firm, I'd say the only people that can help doctors well are people in large.
Oh,
firms,
yeah, no.
And I know that's not true. I do know, however, whether you're a solo lawyer or whether one of 400, if you don't have a lot of experience in this area, you're very likely not going to bring the same level of quality as somebody who's experienced. And so it doesn't, the good things can come in small packages. But
I didn't mean to be disparaging to
either. No, I knew you
were.
I just want to make sure I wasn't either. Small town, large town, I didn't mean that. I just meant an example of something, as we both did, right there.
John, interestingly enough, in my experience, the large firm attorneys, I haven't found many of them that will actually take the time to do a physician agreement. The scope of their practice, and please, you're an attorney, so you could, by all means, right now in front of the world, tell me I'm dead wrong. But I've talked with attorneys, as I was looking for alternatives, and some of the bigger firms were like, no, we don't, we handle, because you handle, and you said it earlier, this is not a quote unquote, a money maker for you. You've got other motives for doing it in addition to whatever the financial component is. But because I did want you to talk about some of the other work you do, because you have a scope of experience. And that was one of the things, John, that totally attracted me to you when we first spoke, because you weren't just an attorney that focuses on physician agreements. And that's not a disparaging comment about folks that just do that. You come with this whole breadth of background. So I would love for you to talk about that for a minute, if you would.
Sure. Well, thank you. First of all, I'm really fortunate. The one thing that's interesting about healthcare law is we always say it's not really a type of law; it's a type of client. And so the beauty is, the clients. For example, when I'm outside general counsel for large physician practices, they will come to me with employment questions, or they want to hire a new janitorial service, or they want to develop a new comp plan for this, or they want to enter into a joint venture. It's a different thing every day, so it's absolutely fascinating. And I love the business advice. I love to be on the inside and understand the economics of what they do. And so I'm really fortunate in that. Yes, I love representing physicians. It's a lot of fun. The work for physician practices, and I do a lot of work for medical oncologists in many different forms, radiation joint ventures. There's a large association of community oncologists, medical oncologists that I work with, and they are deep into data, as you well know, is a big deal these days. And so as you can aggregate the data across many different practices, there are a lot of interesting things you can do with it that help patients and open the eyes of the practices. And so I help with data related issues. I actually work with a large wound care supplier that the fascinating issue is they ship out, I forgot how many boxes it is every night, overnight, to all 50 states. That has some really fascinating issues. Great people, that's a the DME, the durable medical equipment world.
So but was the boxes they ship out? When you said wound care, I thought you were going on another track. So do you know what's in some of those boxes that they ship out?
Okay, sure.
What's in some of those boxes they ship?
Most of the boxes contain, gauze wrap and different types of bandages and coverings. It's those are the typical wound care products for both chronic diabetics and who have pressure wounds, and for other folks who have surgical wounds.
I was going for the skin because seriously,
wounds.
No, I visited one of the wound care centers that I was part of, the system I worked for, and it didn't quite, if I recall correctly, look like skin, but it was. And I'm absolutely botching this up. I wish I was a wound care doctor so I could leave this on, but it was virtually skin that, they graft on and it grows over time to repair.
There are some exotic products like
that's
not the bread and butter, but there are some really exotic, biologic almost products. Thank you. There are putties, and then another thing is there's different putties that they put in, for bones where cancer has eaten out, and it's amazing what the biologics are out there. And sorry, it's not that the blocking and tackling for them is mostly just gauze and wrap. Sometimes it's silver impregnated gauze, is a big deal. But then, the Medicare angle on that is fascinating. It's And Medicare is a big payer, as you know, for all of these folks. So you have to understand the regulatory side of things, which and there's another reason why you want somebody who's experienced, because you have to understand it's not good for the doctor, to have a deal that is non-compliant. Let's say, for example, if the doctor's getting paid more than fair market value and they think they pulled one over on the employer, I no, that's a short-term proposition. So there's the whole regulatory side of this, which is a lot of fun too. The dynamic area out there to understand, where CMS is putting its emphasis and where it's changing things. And there are a lot of changes to the Stark Law proposed right now, which is very exciting, to ease the burdens on. And so that's fun. I love doing I do a lot of deal work, which is interesting. Joint ventures are interesting. A lot of deals. But a lot of these days, as you pointed out, Fred, health systems are partnering with community physicians and practices in interesting ways, because some doctors say, I do not want to be employed. I want to remain independent, yet I want to help the hospital improve its quality and improve its services in the areas where I touch. And so, they have a lot of co-management agreements, we call them out there, where the health systems will engage a group of doctors to help manage, for example, a service line, like an oncology service line or an orthopedic service line, or maybe a heart and vascular hospital, because the hospitals realize that doctors are the ones who understand how to make things work well, and they're the ones that if you have their hearts and minds, they will make something better. And so I find those transactions really fun to be involved in, because very frequently they involve performance improvement initiatives that are on the cutting edge of, you have to look and say, what does the government think is great care these days? Probably not the same thing they thought was great care 10 years ago. So it's interesting to have experts advise on, for example, what constitutes good medical oncology. Surprisingly enough, one of the things is making sure people get to hospice as early as possible. Why is that? Well, you don't want someone to keep getting therapeutic. We all know how caustic and how difficult, chemotherapy is on patients, or radiation therapy. And what you don't want to have happen is somebody keeps getting those therapeutic things with the hope of success when there is no longer hope. And it's kind of a morbid subject, but the government says we need, and the practitioners say, and the hospitals all agree, we need to get people to hospice earlier. So we're going to measure you doctors, and we're going to measure ourselves on how frequently we could cause that to happen. We want that to be, and that's just one of many types of initiatives. It's fun.
John, is that a utilization question? Do you think that's what's driving it, or do you think it's quality of life, or do you think it's a confluence of a number of things that drives that topic that you just said? I'm just curious.
That particular one, Fred, is absolutely a confluence, because where will somebody, again, not to be morbid, but where will somebody die if they have cancer and they are a candidate, they're going to die in the hospital, the most expensive, uncomfortable, demeaning place you can find. So there's an economic angle on this, which is it is a waste of of our country's resources to have, for that particular example, people die in the hospital when they should be either at home with friends, with family, properly sedated and with palliative care for hospice. So it's that one in particular, Fred, is both. It's absolutely both. And many of these things I find are a conflict. Good care tends to follow good economics follows good care. For example, one of the big pushes right now, I know you probably not what the show to be about, but one of the big pushes, of course, is to keep people from going to, after they've had a total joint replacement, or they've had some material, encounter with medicine, like oncology care or something, is to keep them out of the emergency room and to keep them out of being admitted to the hospital. Why? Because that's considered a mistake of the system. It's not about not giving them the care they need. It's about getting them the right care. And the logic is, if you're getting that kind of material, procedure done to you, you shouldn't go to the emergency room because you have a problem. You should be taken care of in a way that you should know. You should be taken care of so that doesn't occur. And so that's a really big push,
mm-hmm.
right?
Well, that's the integrated care approach, and practices talking to each other. And I'm blanking on the payment model, but you are correct. That's been in an initiative for a number of years now. So
sure, the ACOs, right? In terms
ACO, thank you. That's what I was thinking of. The
sure.
ACO.
First it was the DRGs, right? To pay hospitals and say, if you screw up, we're not going to pay anymore. Then the ACOs came along, right? The accountable care organizations to say, here's the baseline for this patient, for this type of condition, and if you can across the continuum of care, Fred, right, as you're pointing out, right, if the hospitals and the physicians and the post-acute sometimes, right, the rehabilitation areas and if you could all work together to lower this total cost for care for these patients, we're going to pay you a portion of that because it's good for everybody.
And I know some of the Medicare plans because I'm not quite there yet. 2.5 years, I'll be a card carrying Medicare patient.
Good for you.
But thank you.
Make sure you get your supplemental. You got to get your supplemental there coverage. Right.
But I have a friend who, and he's actually going to be in one of our future videos, and he is the CFO, COO of a primary care group. And he has explained to me before that one of the revenue streams for their model is based on some of the incentive they get for proper utilization of delivery of care, specifically in the Advantage plan space.
Exactly.
Right?
And not to get too technical, right? But the primary care is where the focus is because they are the point of contact, right? They are the quarterbacks.
Right.
So when you talk about these plans, they call it attribution. When you say, for example, Fred Newmark is a patient who's in this cohort of patients that we're measuring. Well, how do we know that? Well, because Fred is a patient of this. So that's what counts him. That's where that counts him as part of the population for this accountable care organization.
Right.
That matters. And so primary care, I think the government certainly has realized, and many of the think tanks have realized that if the primary care is better and more informed, and part of that is the specialist, of course, this is where the electronic health records, the big push so that the primary care gets the right information back, and it's not maintained by the specialist without being accessible to the primary care doctor so they can actually do something with it and ward off some of these problems. It's really interesting. It's very complicated. This stuff is so complicated. My hat's off to all those who are trying to make it better. Like we are.
Yeah. Agreed.
So I can say one thing that I miss working close to healthcare are some of the just amazing, sometimes hilarious stories that you just pick up on the way. And since you've been on both sides of it, are there any kind of personal favorites that you'd like to share? In my experience, these are always great.
The doctors are characters, right? So there's a lot of, and lawyers are characters, and consultants are characters. So it's a lot of fun to. I'm not sure the stories. I will tell you that the most interesting times I've had have been with one group in particular where it was 7 doctors trying to extricate themselves from a group and get in, join another employment situation. And so I met with them and they said, yeah, we've got some issues here and there. Their phrase was, we got a little bit of hair on this. This is not so clean. I thought, okay, I've seen tough things before. This is no big deal. And so I said, yeah, we can we can make this work. This won't be too difficult. Well, a year and a half later, after we had to settle $1 million lawsuit with a landlord because they had left a place early and just decided to walk away. They had some partners who had healthcare for life promises and provisions that we had to get out from underneath, and all these, and the practice that they were leaving detested them, and so they were fighting to nail. And so it's not so much funny, but it was just we laugh now about, the quote I gave them. I said, oh, this will cost about X. And they said that the minute I walked away, they said, they knew that this was the final exam of extrications. And those are the most interesting. It's fun to help physicians get employed. That's the easy part. The really hard part is to get doctors out of a situation cleanly and then get them into a new one. That's honestly the really fun challenge, because that's where your skills and as a former litigator, I find that things are usually a little bit rocky there. It's not usually for example, how do you get the medical records? Asking usually doesn't work very well. You have to rattle some sabers sometimes, and so knowing which buttons to push and when you look, not doing things that make you look ridiculous and things that actually gain leverage. And that's what you were saying earlier. A lot of this stuff is psychology. It's I've been in this situation. You say to yourself, I've been in this situation before. If I push this hard, I think it's going to be the optimal solution for the client. That's always my guide point: is what's the optimal solution for the client. It may not be the absolute best solution that could be achieved. It's the optimal in the circumstances, and so knowing how to ask for that is key. And so that, not a real funny thing, Jack, but it was. We look at it now and laugh about how absolutely it's like I guess going through boot camp, which I haven't done, but we felt like we were in boot camp there in our own way from a physician lawyer perspective. We came through the wars on that one, and we look back now, and the doctors were in a great situation. I feel really pleased, and that I was able to play a part in getting them there. That's one of the really great things about doing what we all do is to help them, to look back on this and say, these are folks who deserve a good situation. And I feel that about all the doctors I've worked with. I've been really lucky. And to help them get to a situation that you think is the best one that they can get to is really gratifying.
Well, you've just taught me that if I'm ever ready to engage with someone and they tell me that there's some hair in it, it could be hairier than they may be letting me know, or there could be some components that I'm got to put my seatbelt on for. So I guess I really want to just thank you, John, for coming on. As I said, this was the most, I'm thinking it was certainly the longest video we've done so far. But the reason it's been long is because the incredible content and depth of information. And when we ask you a question, you take the time to give mindful layers of perspective to an answer. So thank you for that. And I would love to have you come on again. Perhaps we'll do some sort of a Q&A with folks that are engaged and have questions. And again, I know that I encourage anyone that needs legal help in the healthcare field to give you a call, and the contact information is available through the magic of Jack's expertise. So thank you very much, John, for joining us tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you both. I sure appreciate it.
Thanks so much. I think that's it, guys.
Thanks, Jack.
Sounds like a wrap.
Have a great night.
All right. See ya.
See you guys. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us for another episode. We're looking to have John back for a live Q&A in the future. If you'd like to contact either John or Fred, their information can be found in the description below.